Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second in our When Renters Organise We Can Win events as part of relaunching our Make Renting Fair campaign. So as most of you are aware, I'm Riley. I'm Policy and Campaigns Officer at the Tenants Union of New South Wales. I would like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining today from the beautiful Gadigal country. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend those respects to any First Nations people here in the room with us, and also acknowledge that wherever on this continent, or even across the seas, but wherever on this continent you're joining from today, it is Aboriginal land, and I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging of all the countries from which you're joining today. I think it's really important to keep in mind, as always, in the conversation about renting and housing justice, that while everyone needs a safe, secure place to call home, it's very often First Nations people, First Nations renters, who are most faced with extra barriers, be that ongoing impacts of historical dispossession of land and wealth, discrimination, unequal distribution of resources, intergenerational trauma, and so much more. It's also important to keep front in mind that while we are fighting for housing justice for everyone, we really need to keep in mind that we need to hold space for the complexity of what that actually means, what justice over place looks like when we are on stolen land. So for anyone who has it, I would love if you could put in the chat what country you're joining us from, and or add it to your Zoom name if you know how to do that. I'll give everyone just kind of 10 seconds to do that now before I dive in with some housekeeping. All right, so housekeeping. As Jemima mentioned, and as you might have noticed, you are muted and you are not able to unmute yourselves. I'm really sorry. That's just the best way to make sure that disruption is minimized. But please use the chat. We do want this to be as interactive and relationship building as possible. We will be saving the chat. We'll be keeping our eyes on the chat. Please note also that when we say we will be saving the chat, there's no way for us to do that and not also save private messages. So please just be aware that if you use the private message function, we will be seeing that as well. If you would like to ask a question to either Geordie or Jemima or anyone else really, but anyone who's kind of speaking, just type question ahead of the question. But that being said, if you ask the question in the chat, there's heaps of knowledge and experience in the room, and there may well be other people in the chat who can answer some of your questions for you. Same for anyone who's following along on the Facebook Live. If you have questions, comments, please throw them into the Facebook comment section, and we will be picking those up as well. We are watching. As I mentioned, we are recording this and we will be sharing on Facebook Live. If you're still comfortable with that, please turn on the camera. We want to see faces, but of course we understand if you're not comfortable with having your face on camera in that context. I'd like to ask a little favor. We'd love it if this event can get kind of the most of a boost that we possibly can. So I'm going to take a second now to, from my own kind of Facebook page, share the Facebook live stream. And if any of you are comfortable doing that, I'd really like it if you could as well. So I'm going to drop the link to the Facebook Live in the chat, and then I'm going to share that from my own Facebook. Alrighty, I've just shared. I'll give everyone another 10 seconds to give that a share if you're happy to do that. Alrighty, and if you have any technical issues at all during the event, feel free to either private message anyone who says co-host or host next to their. Did I just send that to the waiting room? I did. I sent the Facebook Live to the waiting room, not to the meeting. That's really embarrassing because there was no one in the waiting room. Okay, you should have it now. I'll give you another 10 seconds to go across and share on Facebook. Thanks, everyone. Okay. So if you have any technical issues, feel free to message anyone who says host or co-host. though preferably not Geordie because he will be presenting. Or you can email contact@rentingfair.org.au, and I'm going to put that in the chat as well. Also, just a note, some of you might be seeing it automatically, I'm not really sure, but we have enabled live transcription. So if that will make things more accessible for you, if you're hard of hearing at all, or you just like having captions on, you should be able to turn that on if you can't already see it. I know I've got it switched on for me. And finally, should go without saying completely, but please be polite, friendly. Please avoid any of the isms, no racism, no sexism, no homophobia, none of that, because of course we want this to be a safe space for everybody. And if it starts to become an unsafe space, we will remove you and you will not be able to rejoin. So with that, I'd love to hand over to Jemima, who will be facilitating tonight's event. Jemima is the Manager of Policy and Advocacy here at the Tenants Union of New South Wales. Thanks, Jemima.
So much, Riley, and thank you to everyone who is here tonight. Thank you for coming along. I am on Gadigal country tonight, and last time Riley got us to think about and talk about a little bit about what we love about the country that we're on. And I was thinking about that today, and it's really easy to jump to things that I love that are really beautiful, like the harbour and the way the light shines on the harbour here on Gadigal country. But today, for the first time, I commuted in to the city, into our office, and I was on the train and I came through sort of the back end coming into Redfern, and I just felt this very strong feeling of familiarity and comfort, and I realized that there's a lot of beauty in the gritty, and I really appreciated actually that kind of that sense of Redfern and that sense of the country that I was coming onto and being in the place that I knew so well. So yeah, I would like to acknowledge Gadigal country today and pay respects to elders, past and present, and those who are in the room with us today. So you may have, I think there are a few people in the room who came to our last event where we heard from Berlin organisers who were talking about their pretty inspiring expropriation campaign. And the idea of these forums is really to explore what it looks like when renters organise and when we win. And the idea is that we want to learn, we want to do this. You are all probably familiar with our Make Renting Fair campaign, but we've still got lots to win. And I think we can learn from some of the success that renters have had overseas. So I suppose, we're all here because we know renting needs to change. And in the lead up to this event, you might have noticed on our social media pages that we shared a story about a renter in New Zealand who had just been to the tribunal. He got taken to the tribunal by his landlord because he had refused access during the COVID lockdown across in Auckland. So it was, there were restrictions on movement. You could only move locally. It was a level 3 alert. All travel and movement was kind of locked down, and yet his landlord was saying, well, it's completely unreasonable that you're not letting me into the house. His story had a bit of a success, or was a happy story, a good outcome in the end. The news report was actually about how the tribunal had said, yep, it's pretty reasonable to say you don't want people coming into your home at a time like this, because you're looking in your home, you have a right to think about the sort of health and safety risks that you might encounter. But the reason that I'm bringing this up actually is that in New South Wales during our lockdown, this was a kind of really familiar situation. We had so many renters contacting us and contacting us directly because they were being asked by their agent or their landlord to allow people into their home for viewings. And our government actually said, we had hard lockdown, we were being told that we should be staying in our homes and staying safe in our homes. And yet the public health orders said, actually, rented homes are a bit different. People can come into your home and you won't have a right over that. Your agent will be allowed to bring people into the housing. And I think for me, that really reflected or epitomized the way that decision makers often think about rented property as investment properties, as assets, and not about our homes. And it's worth, just before I go on, it's worth touching on a couple of the stories of the people who did call in to tell us, what was happening for them in terms of that access. We had a single mum who talked about how she had to go and sit in the car and work from home and her kid was homeschooling while in a car because an agent was taking people through the house to view it. And in Sydney, you could actually have people who weren't looking to relocate and move into their own home. They were just looking at properties for investment. We had a family who had a 6-week-old baby and a toddler and a mother recovering from birth. And they were told, well, you should just take the kids out for exercise or pop down the shops, because those were 2 of the exempted reasons you could leave. You weren't actually allowed to leave because your real estate agent was coming through with other people into your home. And I think just before moving on, you also might have seen just last week there was a report, or Four Corners did a report on the kind of the housing system, but it was really framed as the crushing of the Australian dream of home ownership. And there were a lot of really important things that were raised in the report about how holding property, having property, creates this kind of intergenerational class disadvantage and inequity. It just exacerbates the current kind of problems around wealth distribution. But I think there's something really frustrating about how people always talk about home ownership. And what I mean by that is it makes it seem like the only way you can actually have a home is if you hold title to that home, if you own the home. And I think people forget, actually, who makes homes? We make homes. People make homes. And if government is serious about making sure that we have access to affordable, safe, secure homes, then they actually have to look at improving renters' rights. It shouldn't be the only way that you have an option to get a home is to hold to buy your own home or to hold title to the property. So that's what we're here for. That's what we want to do. We want to change our housing system, our renting system, and make things a bit fairer. We're going to hear from Geordie from Renters United in Aotearoa tonight to talk about what it looks like to organise renters across the Tasman. So a little bit about Geordie. Geordie is the membership secretary at Renters United. He's been campaigning with Renters United since 2020. He is membership secretary and helps develop organising resources, develop strategy for growing the group, and establish strong connections with similar organisations like us. We're really excited to have him here tonight talking about Renters United, their organising model, and some of their campaigning so far, including the People's Review of Renting and a plan to fix renting. And just before I hand over to Geordie, I watched actually Renters United webinar that's worth going and having a look at from earlier this year, which is on rent controls when they were just sort of launching, or they're now campaigning around rent controls in New Zealand. I will drop the link in the chat just after this, and you should go in and chase it up and have a look. But in the webinar, Erin Palachek, who is the National Secretary for the Public Service Union over there, was facilitating, and she shared this quote from Jim Stanford, who's a Canadian economist based here in Australia now. But I really liked it. she really liked it too, but I really liked it, so I'm going to share it again. And Jim Stanford says, the problem is not, he's talking about, you know, how should we consider what is possible? What should we allow ourselves to demand? And and he says, the problem is not scarcity, the problem is power. And I think that's what should frame our discussion tonight. It's an excellent frame for how we think about organising for a better renting system. I don't think we should put limits on what we ask for, but we should think about how we change power, this problem of power. So Geordie, over to you. What are you all doing to address this problem of power?
Awesome. Thank you very much for that, Jemima. I will share my screen shortly, but just before I do, I thought I would introduce myself. I'll first do it in Te Reo Māori, which is the official language of Aotearoa, New Zealand, of the native people, and then I'll summarise what I said in English. Kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, no Manawatu no Ashurst o, ki te whanganui Aotearoa, ki Aro Valley, ko Geordie Takuingua. So thank you very much for having me today. I'm originally from a small town called Ashurst in the Manawatu, which is the land of the rangatane iwi, and moved down to Wellington to sort of study software engineering, and then I discovered this whole world of activism. And so I'm currently living on the land of Te Aotearoa, Ngāti Toa Rangatira, and Taranaki Whānui. So that's a little bit about me, but really what we're all here for today is to kind of learn a little bit about what Renters United does, and how we organise people, specifically renters, to make a difference and to make renting better for everyone in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I did really want to spend a lot of time talking about Renters United, and there is a little bit of context that kind of comes into our campaigning, and it sort of forms the basis of everything that we do. So I thought it'd be cool to run through that first. The first one is the Residential Tenancies Act, and that was created in 1986, so a very long time ago now, and that binds all residential tenancies in Aotearoa, with an exception of very few circumstances, like if you're a flatmate, so you're not on the tenancy agreement, or if you're in a very specific style of boarding house, which is subletted by a university. But pretty much everything outside of that is within the scope of that. And so that sets all of the rules for private renting. So when it was enacted in 1986, New Zealand had the highest home ownership rates that they had ever seen since they started recording home ownership back in 1916. And ever since then, home ownership rates in New Zealand have continued to plummet to the point now where 1/3 of people in New Zealand are renting, and that ends up being about half of the voting population. And that's something that has statistically come out very recently, and that's why we've sort of had a shift in the way that we advocate for tenants' rights. This bill really was once designed for people who were in temporary accommodation. So we're looking at people who were doing like a 12-month contract in a different city, people who were studying, or people who were just saving up to get their mortgage so that they could buy their home. So it really wasn't fit for purpose. It doesn't fit in with what renting is today, where people want their home. They might not necessarily want to own it, or they might just want the freedom that comes with not having to own a home. So given the fact that it was no longer fit for purpose, in 2017, we decided, let's actually go out and let's talk to renters. Let's ask them, what is it like to be a renter? What things do you wish were different? What things do you think could be improved? And so in the end, we talked to over 900 renters in New Zealand. And we did that with a fantastic partnership with an organisation here called Action Station. And really what came out of it is that there were a lot of things wrong with the current Residential Tenancies Act. So a lot of people were talking about the condition of their homes. We have a series of things wrong with homes in Aotearoa. We've got leaky homes, very low insulation homes, very little homes have double glazing or even a heater installed in the lounge, basic things like that. there were also a lot of complaints about landlords and property managers, the time it takes to fix things, or even the security of their tenure. So how easy was it to stay in their rental property? Were they facing the fear of being terminated or being evicted? But also, how easy was it as a tenant to access your rights? There's no point in really having rights if you can't access them, if it's not easy to enforce them. And so we did see about 7% of the cases talking about the tenancy tribunal, which is like our legal way of resolving disputes for tenancies. But we've seen that actually continue to increase over the last few years. So we've got all of the understanding of why tenants dislike renting, what things they want to change about them. And it's very good to go and tell the government that these are the issues, and they really appreciated that. And that is why they started their own review of the rental legislation, which we thought, oh, maybe it's timely that we tell them what they should actually change in the legislation. So a whole bunch of policy advisors, all of which were tenants, a bunch of people who worked in the healthy home space, looking at how do you actually make a home fit for living in, came together and we developed what was called the Plan to Fix Renting. And that's 36 different policy points. Each can be implemented by themselves if for some reason they didn't want to implement all of the awesome 36 policy points. And they all fall into 4 categories that were formed around the main issues people had with renting. So there was having a stable home, fair rent, so making sure that that's the wrong little subtitle there. Fair rent is about making sure that it's affordable and it's set within reason. Safe and healthy. Yeah, so those are swapped around. Safe and healthy is making sure that it's safe in terms of, you've got doors that lock, that it's warm, you've got windows that close, that it's healthy, you've got good ventilation. And the last one was meaningful enforcement, and that was understanding that the current situation we have for tenants to be able to enforce their rights was not working. We had rights that tenants could access, that tenants were supposedly able to access, but actually getting access to those rights was not meaningful in any way. It wasn't allowing tenants to better their quality of life. So I did also include a couple of photos of this. There is one behind me on the wall, and this is the one that we use every single time the government implements some form of policy. We cross the policy off on our Plan to Fix Renting, sort of as like a way to make progress. So I think there's like 4 or 5 crossed off on there now, which doesn't feel like a lot, but when you read into the policy point and you think about how much change that brings, it is quite empowering. So the main thing is, how do we actually organise? One of the key ways that we organise is that we use direct people power. And one of the core things of that is that we will always be an organisation by definition that is by renters and for renters. So the only people within our incorporated society that have the ability to vote or be elected for positions have to be in rental accommodation. The people who are making decisions on behalf of renters must always be renters. And that was set out from the beginning, and it's been super useful to keep that point throughout the whole way. This isn't landlords or property owners who were once tenants leading tenants. This is tenants leading themselves, empowering themselves. We gather ideas, we ideate on them, and we push for the impossible. So one of the great things about coming together is that you can support each other in a way to push for things that you didn't think you could achieve by yourself. And an example of that is rent controls that we started going for earlier this year. A few of the people within the organization were like, rent controls, we'll never be able to get anywhere on that. But when a lot of us came together and were like, actually, as tenants, we want rent controls, we sort of realized that this is worth doing. Even if we just shift the conversation, we shift the Overton window about what is possible when it comes to affordable rent, that is still successful for tenants. We also empower people to make their voice heard. And so that comes from more than just their conversations with their landlords, but it's about having those conversations out in the public domain. So that's through media or through helping them submit to members of parliament. But it's also about having conversations with other tenants as well, sharing those stories, knowing that you have a common struggle and that together you can overcome that, which kind of leads into a steady foundation, which for us is looking at how do you take a group of people who have a shared struggle and organize them to ask for something. And so the plan to fix renting really is our agreed baseline plan. There is always room for it to change, but the expectation from all of the members is that we continue to campaign on what's agreed in the plan. If something is outside of scope of the plan, that's a wider conversation that we need to have with all of the membership. We need to make sure that everything is okay with it, and we need to go through a proper review process to make sure that it is what tenants want, and tenants understand the complexity of what that change would mean, and make sure that their voice is empowered the whole way through that instead of dictating to them what the solution is going to be. Another one that we internally have sort of struggled with a little bit is that we're an organisation that from the onset separated advocacy work and campaigning work. So in New Zealand, there are a bunch of organisations like community law centres, citizens advice bureaus that were already providing that advocacy service, casework, helping people out on individual cases. And what we found from them is they were spending a lot of time. They didn't have enough resource to do all of those things. And then on top of that, make submissions or go out and campaign. And so from the start, we decided that we would be the organisation that would focus purely on campaigning. But that didn't mean that we weren't involved through the casework tangentially. So a lot of our time is spent talking to those other organisations, listening to what's actually happening on the ground, understanding that usually the people that they see coming through their door are people who don't have the systemic advantages that the people can give up time in order to campaign have. So recognizing that the desires of those two groups can be different, and that keeps us connected to what renters actually need, as opposed to what people who are actively involved in the campaigning need. And I guess that is what I mean by we continue to listen, is we are constantly going to those organizations, asking them what they need to be, the government needs to be delivering to them, but also it's going to organizations that represent demographics of people across the country that are otherwise underrepresented in the terms of policy that's delivered, and especially at a systemic disadvantage in housing. And so in Aotearoa, there often is Indigenous populations, the Māori population are not as, the government hasn't given them as many opportunities as they have settlers to create homes for themselves. And so we see a lot more of them in the rental population. And so we need to listen to them, we need to empower them, and we need to make sure that whatever we're doing is also supportive of their mission. And in the same sense, there are other groups like people who have disabilities, sharing their voices as well, and making sure that we are inclusive across the spectrum of renters, understanding that obviously even if younger people have more time to put towards campaigning, there is a whole generation of all the way from people who have retired and would love to have their own home and not be paying rent, to people who are living in young families, so people who haven't even developed the ability to talk yet because they're still a baby. All of those people deserve the same rights in renting. So in terms of organizing those people, what we kind of do 4 things. One of the things we do is push for strong renters narrative in the media. So in New Zealand, we have a couple of groups who have a serious amount of funding, who are constantly pitching stories to the media. And in order to make sure that the narrative stays on housing people and not returning investments, we make sure that we're also pushing a strong narrative in the media. Thankfully, a lot of people who work in the media in New Zealand have now become stuck in rental properties. And so we've seen a more favourable turn in the way that renters are represented. But one of the recent things we've been doing in that space is tracking all of the interactions we have with media, what their reporting levels are like. And so we know across there where our allies are and where we can get our voice heard. The other thing is engaging with political parties, and that also includes local elections and allied campaigns. So we have a limited scope of things that we focus on, but we also support allies who are in the similar space, so like public housing, for example, in order to share their campaigns and reiterate how important housing is across the spectrum. Political parties are sort of one of the campaigning tools where a lot of people can have a conversation with candidates. They can say, I'm a renter and can you promise to deliver this for me during elections or even outside of elections? And the other thing for us was recognizing the amount of power that local bodies had in deciding how housing gets built, where it gets built, and how that then flows on to renters. And so we also have get out to vote campaigns for local elections that share information about what the views of each of the candidates are and which ones are more favorable to renters. The other one is having face-to-face conversations with everyday people. And I've chosen everyday people here because a lot of people who would consider themselves to be everyday people, 20 years ago, they went to university, they got a degree, they studied for a little bit, and now out of that, and they're somewhat out of touch with what the current rental system is like. And so we need to have conversations with those people if we want other people to agree with what we're saying. It's very well to come out and say, we want rent controls, but if they don't understand the actual need for rent controls, then they're going to be less likely to support a call, especially when there's very strong narrative against it. And that's why we empower people to have conversations, not just with us, but with their friends and with their family by doing webinars like the Rent Controls webinar, creating FAQs that allow people to very quickly teach themselves about what we're doing so that they can be campaigning for themselves as well. It's not just us campaigning on behalf of renters, but renters are out there campaigning for themselves by having conversations with their friends and family, having conversations with other renters who might disagree, and that together can help shift the perspective of the wider population instead of just people that you're more traditionally going to reach through doing the same campaigns. Oh, I've lost my mouse. Here we go. So what have we won through organising with renters? The first one that I talked about was the review of the Residential Tenancies Act. And that really was sparked by just highlighting how bad renting was. It was saying to Parliament, look, I don't think you actually understand just how bad the situation is, and you need to change some things. So some of the things that we won through the review of the RTA was an end to no cause terminations. So you now need to provide a reason from a very specific list. And even when it's from that list, the earliest is like 63 days notice. Apart from that, it's all 90 days notice. The healthy home standards have also come in recently. So you now have to have a heater installed in your lounge. If you want to rent out a property, you have to have an extractor fan in the bathroom. And another one is name suppression and the abolition of letting fees. So before this came in, a landlord was basically able to say, I'm going to let you the property, but it's going to cost me like $600 to send the bond form in. And they would just charge you like 3 weeks rent for that. But now they can't. It's understood that the cost of rent includes the service of that rent. And really, when you think about it, if it doesn't include that, what is your rent for, except for paying someone else's mortgage? Our current campaign we have on rent controls as our main campaign. And so although this started out as we're going to go, oh, yep, let's do a short, sharp rent controls campaign, get someone to commit to it. What we found is actually there are a lot of myths out there about rent control, comparing old rent controls to what are called modern rent controls. And so a lot of our time was spent debunking those myths. It was also talking to tenants who mostly had no idea about what rent controls meant. It was controlling rent in some way, but what idea were we proposing? What is the actual broad spectrum of options available, from dictating the price of every property to very simple interventions like freezing rent for a fixed period of time. And so what we actually saw through that campaign was quite a large shift of the Overton window in New Zealand, which I believe is like the realm of possibility, is like another way of describing it. And that has allowed us to regather what we want to do and focus on what our next steps were going to be, where we're going to target those next steps. Our most recent win, thankfully, this is why you make presentations real last minute, because we got this news yesterday, was that we've been working with the Office of the Privacy Commission to develop a compliance framework. So previously landlords were asking everything from, how often do you go to fast food restaurants? They were asking to see your bank statements. They were asking a whole bunch of information that really was interfering with the privacy of tenants. And so there's now an easier complaints process. It could be entirely anonymous. There's a clear set of rules that landlords must follow, which makes it much easier for tenants to enforce than they have to ask things that are reasonable, which is so hard to understand. And there's also easier access to compensation, which means you can take your landlord to the Human Rights Tribunal for invading your privacy and get some financial recuperation from the pain that you went through of them asking for information they'd never needed in the first place. So that is my presentation. I know we've got time for questions and answers as well. But I really wanted to iterate the fact that it's not only that you have to be, like, you don't actually have to be super organized, but coming together, sharing a vision, and just communicating that vision to people can actually lead to really positive outcomes. Thank you.
There's a lot of clapping, I think, across the online space. That was really great, Jodie. I am really excited and inspired by what you have been running through. I am going to open up for people to ask questions. We've got a couple that have just come through. And I'd encourage people to pop questions in the chat, but also I think we are now just trying to facilitate it so it's possible for you to unmute yourself and ask a few questions. So yeah, you can also pop your hand up to say that you would like to ask a question. What I might do just before we go to questions, I have a question, I think there are a couple of questions in the chat, is let people have a tiny break where they get to stand up and stretch. And I believe that we have some trivia poll questions, some trivia questions ready to go, so that some of you may choose not to stretch, although that is a mistake. And if you choose not to stretch, or even if you do, you can go ahead and take a punt and see how you go on the trivia poll.
Oh, this whole time I had been researching Australian rental trivia.
Oh no.
No, it's on New Zealand rental trivia.
You should be the clear winner here, so it's going to be a bit embarrassing if you get it all wrong. No pressure.
Oh, these are very good questions.
I believe we have Riley to thank for the questions.
Oh, fantastic.
Riley, I'm going to ask you to jump in because I am not a Zoom aficionado, so I'm not sure about how we can how we read the polls.
I'm watching all the responses kind of rolling in. We've had 11 people answer the question so far. Maybe I'll give like 10 more seconds if anyone wants to answer, and then I'll end the poll. Oh yeah, we've had a number 12.
I feel like there's one question here that I do not know for certain, and that makes me feel bad because I read the report that has that stat in it like last week.
All right, I'm gonna end it now. And Jemima, do you have the answers in front of you, or do you want me to tell people?
Are you able to publish? I just can't see it yet, so maybe it is published.
Oh,
but
share the results. Yeah,
share
I
the
have
results.
to hit that one.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So for those of you who are playing along at home, I will give you the answers. The most common reason for New Zealand renters or renters in Aotearoa to move from one rental to another over the past 5 years is tenancy ended by landlord. So actually, most of us got that right. In New South Wales, it's around, I think, tenancy ended by landlord is around 25% in New Zealand. So a quarter of renters who are moving are doing it because of an eviction. And in New South Wales, it's around 15%. I don't know the answer to this one. The proportion of renters aged 65 or older in New Zealand that live in social housing is closest to, Riley, can you tell us?
1 in 3.
1 in 3, wow, that's so interesting. I wonder what that looks like here. I actually don't know, but if I find out, I will try and share it with everybody in the room. The percentage of New Zealand renters that do not have a formal rent agreement is closest to. Do you feel confident about this one, Geordie?
Oh, I
won't put you on the spot.
no
Riley,
idea.
what's the answer?
It's 9%.
9%.
Because I wondered, like,
that's
if you
high,
include
actually.
all of the flatmates in that, there could
Yeah, really interesting.
And about half of people who rent from friends and family don't have a formal agreement.
Yeah,
right. Alrighty, so it's 6:45. Let's jump in and let's make sure we have time to chat and answer some of the questions that have come up. One of the first questions that came up in the chat that I've seen is just, what does your membership look like? How many members might you have? And that's actually kind of in line with my question, so I'm going to ask it at the same time, just around, I think you've given a really good overview of the motivation for starting, and then some of like the structures and principles that you organize with. But what's like how did it start? What's the origin moment? Were people connected already in just locally, or has it been an online phenomenon? But yeah, so there's lots packed into that. I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, I'm gonna get the dates wrong probably, but there was a very specific general election where both of the major parties in New Zealand were talking about the housing crisis, and a group of about 5 renters came together and they were asking, why is it that when we talk about the housing crisis, the only thing we talk about is owner-occupied dwellings? We only talk about being able to buy your own home, when we know for a fact that more and more people are renting homes. And so the 5 of them, I'm pretty sure it was 5, shared with their friends. They were like, we're going to meet down on a street and we're going to have a talk about this. And basically from there, it started growing. And it was at the start, informal. There was a bunch of people that got together and they met every now and then to talk about renting and what things they could do. And it wasn't until later, around the People's Review of Renting and the Plan to Fix Renting, that it shifted to more of that, let's organize and mobilize renters, and let's rely less on just the same 5 people doing things and doing what they think is a great idea by asking a few of their friends, and make it a more formal process. And so we became an incorporated society. We started to describe what members looked like, and from there it really just started growing into having branches, which are like geographic based groups of people. having working groups, which are groups of people that focus on specific things, like whether it's campaigns or social media, talking to the media, things like that. And that's kind of where we're at today, is we've got that set up, and that's how we campaign together.
Thank you. And maybe this is a bit of a tricky question. What about funding?
Funding, yeah. So we are quite closely connected with unions across New Zealand. From my knowledge, we've never accepted any funding from the government, and I don't think the government has ever reached out to provide us with funding. But in that sense, it means that we can be quite critical of the government. The only real connection that we have to the government is that we sit on an advocacy network, which is a group of people that advocate for tenants' rights, and that the administration of that network is funded by the government, and that's as close as it gets. So the rest really is donations from unions, our members, and from grants as well.
I am just seeing a few questions popping up in the chat. One of them actually is for the tenants. It's for us in a sense, and it's about the tenants union and membership. So I'm going to I'm going to jump to the question. Sorry, Geordie.
That's all good.
I've just lost my chat and I can't seem to find the question here, but it was from Emily, and I think it was in relation to, the tenants union started off over 40 years ago as a members-based organisation. We're still a members-based organisation, but there's a question around how many members we have, and it might be that I throw to Leo if he's in the room, or I can come back to me, but I might actually ask Robert if he has his microphone on and is able to unmute to talk a little bit about the origin of the tenants union. Robert, who is in the room with us, was actually there when they did do some of that early community organising to set up a tenants union. Robert, do you have... Hey, look at that.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Robert. Do you want to talk a little bit about how the tenants union started?
I'm shouting or too quiet because I am also partly deaf. Back in the in the early 1970s in Australia, federally, we had a poverty inquiry, and one of the major reports to that inquiry identified the scandalous state of residential tenancy law across all states. Now, that was in the heady days. Well, that poverty inquiry report finally was published in the heady days of the Whitlam era, when there was a lot of organising on the ground. At that time, there were a number of organisations who were pushing renting issues. Shelter New South Wales was one of those organisations, and it had a working group called the Tenancy Working Group, and that included most of the people on that committee would have been renters. Many had ties to advocacy organisations, and so after about a year of being a working group of shelter, we decided to set up our own organisation called the Tenants Union of New South Wales. And that was the origin of the Tenants Union. From day one, we set up voluntary tenants advice services, and we gave advice and documented the stories of tenants who are having hassles with landlords and real estate agents. And all of those stories we brought together in campaigns for legislative change, etc. yes, we were a membership organisation. We still are. Like in New Zealand, we precluded people who weren't tenants or representatives of tenant organisations from being on our board. That is still the case. It's always been very, very hard to organise tenants. We acknowledge that, especially in Australia, where most landlords are cockroach landlords, mum and dad investors. They would only own one or two properties. So unlike landlords who have a lot of tenants, it's very hard to organise tenants. But we've grappled with that issue, sometimes successfully, sometimes not successfully. Anyway,
Thank you,
the
Rob.
Story of the beginning of the tenants union.
I'll jump back in. Emily, we're going to come back and confirm membership numbers, but I think we encourage people to be members. And I think one of the things, though, is that we do want people to feel like they can connect with us and be tenants union supporters without having to become formal members. And I think it's tricky for us too, Jodie, you mentioned, and I think this is a smart and strategic move, really, kind of the decision that you have made as Renters United when you started organising to say we're just going to do campaigning, but then connecting in with advocacy groups. So we're starting from a slightly different position, but it's going to be interesting to see how we go sort of managing that, the advocacy role that the tenants union plays in some spaces, and a network of advocacy services, and the campaigning. There's lots of other questions, so I'm going to jump ahead to some of these questions. There's a question from Peter in the chat, and he's saying it seems to him like New Zealand is a bit more advanced in terms of renters' rights, and perhaps one reason is that in Australia, housing is tied to economic growth and wealth, which the government promotes. What do you think? And also, I think he's interested in that divide between private rental and public housing. What does it look like in New Zealand? Here in Australia, it's been on a downward curve, like on a downward trend. We're seeing less and less of housing stock is actually, and renting stock is public housing. It's dwindling.
Yeah. Cool. I'll see how quickly I can answer this, because there's kind of multiple lengths to which I could go to answer this question. And I think Aotearoa, New Zealand and Australia have similar legal structures and similar views of what housing is. And it kind of stems back from this colonial infinite expansion and land being the predominant resource for creating wealth, and the dispossession of that land from Indigenous populations in order to continue the infinite expansion of wealth. And so we do see quite strongly entrenched property rights in New Zealand, and I imagine that's similar in Australia. I mean, in New Zealand, the Prime Minister and the current party in government has committed to ensuring that property prices continue to rise, which, like any other investment, you invest and take a risk, and the risk is that it might go up or down, but that committing to continuing it to rise has been a big factor in people continuing to invest in rental properties, especially people like Robert was talking about earlier, the cockroach landlords who don't actually have the money to provide a rental property. And so the government that we have still has a vision of everyone owning their own home. They've made it very clear that their vision is on home ownership and not having a home. And so they're increasing the amount of state housing that they're building, but it's nowhere near enough to keep up with the demand for state housing. And that's purely because their interest is focused on people owning their own homes. And that's why we see less attention on renting, less attention on state housing. And it's more about sort of subsidizing private landlords so that people can live in properties that are owned by people and not the state.
Yeah, I think it sounds actually like a very similar kind of landscape to political landscape and system and colonial story.
Yeah.
One of the other things that came up when we were doing the poll, you might have noticed or we saw that people are still moving primarily because of evictions. They're being forced to leave by landlords. One of the questions that's come up is, what do you think that might be? I said it preliminarily, because no grounds is out of the question, is off the table now. Do you think it's a bit of a reflection that no grounds was still in the mix, or are there other things at play there?
Yeah, so I guess one of the things that came in with the reform to the RTA is that it was very slowly introduced. And so the last set of introductions to that, which included the nose cause evictions, only took effect from the 11th of February this year. And unfortunately, the way that it was drafted as well is it's for any tenancy agreement that was signed after the 11th of February. And that doesn't include renewed tenancies or extended tenancies. It's only new tenancies. And so for a lot of those people that are in those tenancies, we will continue to see the primary reason being termination by landlord. But I think as time goes on, what we're going to see is people moving to properties because the one that they're living in is either no longer sufficient or because the price increase they've faced and the rent they have to pay is so large that they have to move somewhere else.
Sense. And I can see that we're coming up to 7 o'clock. So I'm hoping that there are a couple of extra questions here, and I might see if we do have time to get to them. But I think there's a great question here from Isadora, which is, in terms of organising, what's been your most successful tactic to date? Is there anything that you think is a bit inspiring, or that we could, that's really worked for you?
There have been some interesting ones. It's kind of weird, like some of our most successful things have been, I guess, tangential to the campaign. So like we've had a couple of concerts that were fundraising concerts, and just like the sort of attention that the bands bring to renting advocacy. A lot of ours has, especially most recently, has come from media attention, because being in lockdown, it's quite difficult to do a physical protest or anything like that. And so for a lot of our protests, we took it from, let's get a bunch of people out onto the lawn, to what's a quirky way that we can get a couple of members of the media to turn up and then broadcast that to a wider audience who couldn't physically be there. And so one of the things we did was putting rent controls back on the table. And so we had a cake that was baked and it had the word rent controls on it. And like we got some MPs out, some supporting organisations and unions to come out, and we just put the cake on the table. And it was like absolutely bucketing down with rain. But the media was there and they covered it, and they shared our message that rent controls is very much still an option that's on the table. Then the following weeks, ministers were being asked questions about rent controls. Is it off the table? Is it on the table? And so just little quirky things like that can be helpful, especially when you don't have the ability to reach everyone.
I love it too, because he's going to say no to cake.
Exactly.
I mean, come on.
Yeah.
So it's appealing to everyone. Which rent controls, people should be open to trying a little bit of rent control now.
Exactly.
And then. Well, I think that just because it's 7 o'clock, I might formally draw us to a close. There's still some really great comments in the chat. I know there's a couple of questions around, will, now that we are making up more of the more people are renting, and a lot of us are renting for life, is this going to change the way that we can organise? I think that's a really good, and you mentioned that a little bit too in New Zealand, that we're starting to see more and more people renting. And I was really interested to hear that third of the population is around half the voting population. That's really powerful, I imagine, when you're walking in to talk to decision makers. Yeah, so I want to thank you very much, Geordie, for coming and telling us about how how you work, how Renters United works, and I think we will take away a lot of thinking, a lot of ideas to mull over.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. If people want to stay, oh, there's lots of clapping. Yay, can we have a big clap for Geordie, and a big thank you for making time to chat with us this evening. Yay, cheering. And I'd like to invite everybody who would like to stay on for a bit more of a discussion to stick around. Otherwise, feel free if you need to head off. And Riley, I'll just ask if there's anything else that you wanted to share with people before we formally close and move into the more informal discussion after.
Yeah, just a heads up just ahead of time. I don't know if anyone's noticed, but my Zoom has been continually crashing, so I've been in and out. So I apologize if I vanish halfway through talking. Firstly, just thank you so much, Geordie and Jemima and everyone else who's been helping and everyone who's come. The bits that I was able to be here for, I've really learned a lot, and it's been really great. Just in terms of letting you know what the next steps are, we're hoping we'll be able to fit in one more of these events before Christmas. I think you'll all know we had one a couple of weeks ago, then we have obviously had tonight, hoping for one more kind of similar learning type event, and then kicking off 2022 strong with more of a interactive organizing meeting where we really kind of come together as the community of renters and start discussing our ideas and our plans and our scheming for what Make Renting Fair is going to kind of shoot off to next year. We are in the process of building a website, and a really important component of that is being able to share stories from everyday renters like most of yourselves. So if you have a renting story that you would like to share with us, I would be so very grateful. I will just drop the link to share your story in the chat. And if you have a renting story you'd like to share with us, please share that with us and I can be in touch. Finally, we have a petition that we launched at our last event, which I've also dropped in the chat. So if you are able to click on one or both of those links and do some of the things and or ideally share with a friend, a colleague, a family member, that would be absolutely great. And also watch this space for our next upcoming events. I think that's it. I will stop the Facebook Live and stop the recording now, but feel free to stick around. You will be allowed to unmute yourselves now for a bit more of an informal chat.